Joe.
All right. Hi, everyone again. So we're at the first round of probably several meetings to do the I'll say challenge. Oh, there we go. Well, maybe, yeah. Challenging work of going through the actual draft ordinance. As I mentioned before, I'll just go through some housekeeping, but as I mentioned before, I wasn't gonna go write a full ordinance and drop it on your lap, that we were gonna kind of try to do this in chunks. And also, we'll have this meeting in about, like I said, 3 o'clock. We'll try to wrap it up somewhere. Hopefully we're done, but if not, that's okay. It happens. And we'll just pick that up as the start of the next meeting, but I continue to kind of work through the drafts. The next one will be the zoning districts and land use, principal uses, which I suspect will take a significant amount of discussion because we are talking about several changes to the district structure and expanding it, and we've talked about a lot of land use issues in the city. So, as you hopefully noted, in these drafts, before we go to final adoption where I can clean it up, I try to do this for the benefit of the committee, but also when this ultimately gets, revised and put up for review. I have footnotes in there and references to the existing code, so people get a feel for like why did we make this change or note this change. And then I'm gonna let you're fine. So that just helps in gauging where things came from with regards to the existing code. Is it something you had? Or something completely new. For the most part, there's a lot of new stuff.
Yeah.
As we talked about the code audit, you have subdivision standards, but the procedures weren't actually in there. So, we just kind of have to start with something and we go through it and we tailor this to make sure that it all fits what you want to try to accomplish. You'll see the process that we've kind of talked about using is I'll draft this. We'll have either in-person meetings or I'll be participating virtually, trying to save money and have more meetings that way. We'll go through and do that. I will, once we get through these chapters I sent you, I'll make the revisions and then we'll kind of more widely distribute that. Not that these aren't public meetings or anything like that, but we want a first shot to refine it first before we kind of release it to the greater public and say, hey, you can start to take a look at this. At any point, comments are welcome, and we may work out a process of where people can submit comments. So with that, what the usual process is, we'll kind of work through each chapter, each page. I'll kind of point out some main things. We're not gonna read every line, but you'll also note that in several of the footnotes, I did highlight in yellow some discussion points and questions. Yes. You'll see that throughout the drafting process because there's a lot of, especially as a city, there's just a lot of ways where you might want to do one thing, you don't. I'm trying to kind of suggest things that we've seen positively work in other communities, but that doesn't mean it's the best way to do it for you, and that's quite okay. I don't have a dog in this fight. I just want to make sure that this code is ultimately what's going to work best for the city and your kind of processes and stuff like that. So, any questions on how we're going to work our way through this?
This is all online, it's generated by hard copy. Can it be? Because I'll do some work on it here and there wherever I might be.
So, it's obviously being sent to the committee right now, and the idea is we would let the committee take the first round of comments, and then I would make revisions before, posting that to the website to say, hey, the committee has already reviewed this is the direction we think we're gonna go with that, and then allow that to be reviewed by the broader public. Again, we're all trying to be transparent, but we just want to make sure that the committee has the first kind of discussion points, especially since, like I mentioned, you'll see as we go through here, there are a number of questions that we'd like to get answered and finalize a little bit before we put this out. We'll be posting these chapters as we go along, so it's not like we're gonna wait till the end of the process to post it all. We will be posting these, again, just after we get through it with the committee. So with that, the first chapter is usually the easiest chapter. It is something that is largely new, there were a couple pieces that I found, but this is kind of the boilerplate language almost every code has that applies across the board. And this is where I found that you were missing a lot of pieces that most communities have. And for example, you have some purpose statements as you go through the code, especially for zoning districts. But you don't have an overall, why are we doing this kind of thing? This kind of sets up the intent of the ordinance. And specifically like references to the master plan and it's why have zoning and subdivision. So, you know, this is kind of a draft of a typical purpose statement that works for communities like New Philadelphia. Does it come into play a lot? No. But it gives a reasoning to think through why you have, you know, the other types of regulations in here. The scope and authority, again, is new. This is just laying out where all these rules apply. Again, standard, just laying it out there. This is particularly, and a lot of these language don't come into play unless somebody asks you a question and you can point to something. So this is obviously setting out where the authority of this applies. The title, this just allows us to call, because it gets called different things, even in your current code it gets called different things. So this just sets this out as part 11 of the codified ordinances, and that it may be called, it's usually called the code, but the planning and zoning code. The effective date, this is technically an update of your existing ordinance, so ultimately, and you'll see this little symbol here throughout the throughout the draft, it's just where we'll eventually have some cross-references or information, but ultimately we'll want to put in the original effective date of the existing ordinance, because this is again just an amendment. General applicability, you do have this language kind of buried in there, but this basically sets out that, you know, if you're going to build a building or a structure or establish a land use in the city, you're going to be subject to this code. And that the essential services, so putting in water and sewer lines, electric, all of that is not subject to zoning. It very rarely is. But if somebody's building a building related to that, the building itself would be. Master plan, I know you have part of your master plan in place, but there's going to be a continuing evolution of that. So this just references that, you know, as you move forward, the planning commission, council, boards, commissions should be looking to that master plan for guidance. It's not holding your feet to the fire on it, but it is especially going to be a good guide for decision making. So courts generally give cities the benefit of the doubt if you make a decision that aligns with your master plans or whatever types of plans you have and the decisions you're making about it, because that means you've thought through kind of what you want to try to achieve. Interpretation and conflicts, you actually have a little bit of this language in the current ordinance, but for the most part it's a little bit new. So this just makes sure that, you know, if there is some kind of conflicting ordinance out there, the most restrictive language would apply. For the most part, conflict, you know, state law and stuff like that, if the state says you can or can't do things, the state's probably going to, especially in the things that they're saying you can't do, and more we're seeing a little bit of that, that's going to be where the more restrictive applies. So in that case, the state would control. General rules for interpretation, this is language that's just, if it's a term is singular, it's also considered to be the plural. This is basic word interpretation. Relationship with third party private agreements. This is not, you don't have to have this language. This isn't a provision or a standard. What this is real handy for is for staff. So when somebody wants you to come in and say, hey, my homeowners association has this requirement that we have a certain type of fence, the city can go, we're not responsible for those private covenants. We're not the ones enforcing that. Now, if they're saying, oh, we can have a 8-foot fence and the city says, no, you can only have 6 feet, then the city's enforcing their own rules. But this has become more and more prevalent as we see more and more private deed restrictions and the like. So again, this isn't something you're enforcing, it's not a standard. It's literally just something to be like, no, sorry, good luck. Compliance with your building and fire prevention codes, those are very important codes, you have those. This is just a cross-reference to make sure that people understand that they all work in concert, but those rules apply and those procedures apply. Restoration of unsafe buildings, if, a building is about to collapse or the like, this wouldn't prevent somebody from bringing it back into at least stable condition. This is also where I added a cross-reference to the building code. Use of graphic table and illustration figures. As I've mentioned, we're going to be using a lot of tables and a lot of graphics in here. For the most part, the graphics in particular are meant to supplement text. So when we say, hey, this is how we measure a building height, we might have a graphic that says, look, this is how we measure a building height. What this is saying is, in those cases, the text is the ruling language, not necessarily the graphic. Now, I pride myself in that I haven't come across where I've created a conflict in graphic versus text, but this is, again, where we're trying to put the emphasis on the text and the graphic is just supplemental. Burden of proof. This puts the burden on the applicant to demonstrate that they meet the requirements of this code. Now, does staff often help? Yes. This is not saying you can't do that. But this is also preventing them from relying on staff to put essentially their arguments together for them when they just want to be like, well, I don't know if it's non-conforming. Well, you need to go find this in this document. So it's not, again, it wouldn't be them looking for the document, they can provide guidance. Severability, all this is, and this is pretty standard quality language. If a court says section 1101.01 is unconstitutional, that means that that section is not enforceable or is unconstitutional, not the rest of the chapter, not the rest of the code. Again, all standard language. Transitional rules, I talked about this in the code audit. This language is going to be helpful for you in probably the first year or two that the new code goes into effect. What this is talking about is if somebody a week before this becomes effective applies for a use or a conditional use, if they apply before it goes effective, it goes through your current ordinance. Now, let's say they've applied and got a permit to build a house or something like that, or build a building before this, but now all of a sudden they realize they like the new code. This would give them an option to come in and re-propose whatever, something related to the new code. So technically they're beholden to the existing code that's in place at the time, unless it expires, but we do give them an option to opt into the new code. So the timing, I don't know if on your conditional use approvals and stuff that you have now, if you say, you've got a year to get that in place, but if there's a building permit tied to it, if that building permit expires, that would also trigger the new code. So that's, all this would come, again, this is really first year or two. After that, you likely could even remove it if you wanted to. Because by that time, most people are going to be using the new code, and you might have a straggler or two that, was in the way. And then the last section, vested rights. Ohio has their own vested right rules that, we're not trying to usurp. So that's it. This is the easiest chapter we're ever going to go through. Sorry. From here, it's all going to be a little bit more brain power, but again, this is all just standard, I hate to call it boilerplate, but it is. Most communities have this because you'll need this in certain scenarios. So, sure. Any other questions on that chapter in particular? All right.
Okay.
Now we get to move into decision-making roles and authorities. So this chapter is just focused on the different boards and the different staff that are involved in reviews and decision-making within the planning and zoning code. You have a little bit of this. I mean, your planning commission, you reference the state code currently, which is fine. We reference that as far as the establishment. have the Board of Zoning Appeals, and then we pulled in the Design Review Board. Because as you'll recall, the Design Review Board and the Downtown Design Standards are actually in the building code right now. And the recommendation of the code audit was to transfer all of that to the Planning and Zoning Code, because it really has more to do with that. So I've pulled all that and incorporated into this chapter. So again, going back to review authority names and references, do you have to have this language? No. But it always helps because there's always a random reference to, again, the board or the BZA, and everybody's like, what is that? Okay, this is what you go back to. Delegation of authority. So for the most part, you'll have seen it at this point in these review procedures, when we reference particularly staff members, which is the code administrator, occasionally it might be the service director, or the city engineer. What that means is that person or anybody that person delegates their authority to. So the code administrator might have inspection staff or whatever it is, so they can assign that authority. And if you'll recall in this code audit, the reason why we had the code administrator that's not technically tied to any particular job title in the city is that gives you a flexibility that depending on what your staffing is at any point in time, the code administrator could be the building official, it could be the service director, it could be whoever you want to, as mayor and council, put in that position. So it can flex a little bit with the current staffing and resources. But that's kind of helpful for that.
So you could say like the service director or his designated agent would
Yes.
work. Okay.
Yeah. Same with the city engineer. One of the definitions we'll add with city engineer, typically in a lot of cities of this size might include either the city engineer or their authorized consultant, if you've got outside consulting services or something like that. So that would also include that kind of authorization. So then we move into the roles of each of the boards. So city council, you have some important roles. You are obviously the one designated with adopting this ordinance language. So you'll hear, review, and make decisions on that. We don't have, you'll probably have noticed, we don't have the procedures for the plan unit development section that we've talked about incorporating here in this code yet. That will be a chapter we talk about. So I have just preliminarily put in here what I think the role will be, at least as I was drafting. But that could change, that's the footnote, that could change as we move forward. You're obviously responsible for accepting where appropriate the improvements that happen during subdivisions, establishing fees for the development review procedures, and any other kind of roles of this code related as may be established in the code, which there are none, or the ORC. Again, all of these may change a little bit as we go through these procedures. The subdivision, again, you don't really have an established procedure now. I put in what is the most common procedure I see with cities of New Philadelphia's size, but that doesn't mean you're beholden to that. For the most part, cities put most of the review authority of of subdivisions in the planning commission's realm, because that's what the ORC is kind of set up as. But there are cases where I see the city council wanting a say in at least some of the preliminary plat or the final plat review. So we'll have that discussion, and that would automatically change this. The review boards. So instead of repeating a whole bunch of language about how you vote, that you can have bylaws for each of the three boards, I just put it all in one section, and this is the language that would apply to Planning Commission, the BZA, or the Design Review Board. So a lot of this language is actually pulled from your from your current code and just consolidated here. So for example, the review boards are supposed to be made up of members of or residents of the city. With the exception that Planning Commission, the service director can often, or sometimes doesn't live in the city, so we allow that exception. And you also have provisions in your design review board that would allow for certain members to be from outside of outside residents. So that's just the exception there. One of the things I added here, number 4, oh, it's pretty zoomed in there, I was gonna maybe zoom in a little bit. 4 is, hopefully you never have to do this, but we added some language about how a board member could be removed if they're never showing up to board meetings. If they're consistently, if they're acting in conflict of interest, anything like that. There is a process by which you appoint them, and this would allow a process by which you could recall them. Vacancies would be filled through the rest of the term. They can adopt bylaws, they need to keep records of their meetings and hearings. They're all review board meetings, just like council, are open to the public unless specifically exempted by law, and that's, in the review board scenario, that's very rare. And that the departments of the city are gonna cooperate with it. I don't know why we have a random line in there, but first, and I didn't highlight this question, but first line of question is, the one piece of language I added in here, and this was not brought up, this wasn't big enough to rise to the code audit, but I've added some language in here that would allow, at least for the consideration of appointing alternates to the different boards. Some communities don't wanna worry about this. Some communities like the option, which is how I put it in here, you don't have to have alternates. But, the reason why we see alternates being appointed to boards is if, you need to wanna make sure, as best you can have, is 5 members. Sometimes an alternate can step in when there's going to be a board member, the regular board member who's gonna be absent. They tell you, hey, I'm not gonna be able to make it to this meeting. And then you can call on the alternate. Or B, they're conflicted, they have a conflict of interest, in which case they hopefully would recuse themselves, in which case an alternate could step in for that particular case. So this just lays out rules for if the city would opt to appoint alternates. But I wanted to open this one, this is the first one I wanted to open a discussion, if it's even something you would like to have as an option.
I don't think we've had that much of a problem getting quorums, but, this could be handy, I suppose, at times.
Oh, I think with the ordinance, Mayor, if you remember a couple times since, there's been some folks that's had to abstain because of.
Yes,
On planning
conflicts.
commission ones, you know what I mean, so.
Right,
That could be a case where, instead of just abstaining, have somebody, an alternate,
right,
just throwing it out there. I know that we've ran
Yeah.
into that in planning commission wise.
right, we have, yep, good point.
I can't read the language real well, but if you're gonna put in an alternate, you want the alternate to reflect the interests and got somebody on a board who's there because of expertise.
Mhm.
Or put in an alternate who has somewhat the same expertise, or you're just gonna pick anybody to sit in that seat.
So the alternates are appointed in the same manner as the applicable boards. So the alternate would be for like a planning commission, which is typically where we see a lot of action. And the BZA, you have a BZA that has a lot of authority. The same criteria for which the mayor would select and the council would appoint would be based on the same requirements. Could they be identical interests? Maybe not, but they should have the same qualifications to serve on the Board of Zoning Appeals. At the same time, one of the things this said is if they start the process of a hearing, let's say it's not that they've abstained, let's say they just weren't there. If the alternate steps in to hear a case, the alternate should be the one, let's say it's continued, to be continued in that discussion. So it's not that the regular member would come in and, I'm gonna take over. No, the alternate would continue to the end of the case.
Follow that all the way through to the
Yes.
end for the decision. Yeah.
Because you wanna make sure, part of this is just good board-making, decision-making is whoever is making the decision should be involved in all the discovery, all of the discussions, hear all of the public comment and the like.
Right.
Now, as far as your question about, the qualifications and stuff like that, the only, other than being residents, and I don't know outside of this what you look for in planning commission, board of zoning appeals, the only board that the city has where there's very specific qualifications is in the design review board, and that they would have to meet those qualifications if you were applying, an alternate. So keep it. Again, this is not saying you have to appoint alternates, it's just giving you the opportunity to be able to do it.
Yeah, I say keep it. I don't hear any opposition.
I agree with you, it could come in handy at times, I haven't seen it ran into too often, but that doesn't mean next week it's not gonna happen, where we're like, oh man, we should have done that.
Well, I mean, this is one, this gives you up to 2, I think.
Yes.
A lot of times, most, communities might, only appoint 1 until they see, if you're constantly having issues with quorums or something like that, then all of a sudden, either A, you're having a discussion about, is that board, like, are all the board members really, making the effort, but 2, you might wanna have an additional alternate depending on what's going on.
Definitely keep everything flowing, I mean,
Well, the other thing is, and you have language in here that I've maintained and clarified, is that, especially with all the BZA decisions, and this is, I would have suggested this anyways, but you do have this language that says it takes a concurrence of 3 members to move something forward. So you're not saying, oh, 3 is a quorum, so 3 people show up, and only majority of the quorum can move something forward. That means 2 out of a board of 5 could theoretically move, no, you say what I usually like, which is, you got 3, you're gonna have to get all 3 of those members to be on board. Now, what applicants sometimes get worried about is can be risky, depending on the application. So a lot of times, they may ask to postpone until they think they'll get a bigger board, or, that's where you might decide it would be better to have 5 people with eyes on this, or something like that.
Yeah, I think, and then also with the alternate, I don't know that we have much of a problem as far as quorum-wise over with planning, but Board of Zoning Appeals definitely has that at times. And like you're saying, we have 3, it's written that we have to have 3 to move anything. And we had a similar thing, I forget, there was 3 and it was 2 to 1, and they're like, what do we do? It's not approved, you
Yeah.
gotta move. So I think on that, with 2 alternates would be key. And then Dick was just saying, something about the fact of, sometimes if you have a developer coming in, and planning commission had to put a meeting together to get some approval, couldn't get everybody, maybe get enough alternates to move something forward quickly or something like that. But planning is very, well attended. The zoning appeals can be challenged sometimes,
Okay.
for sure. So I think that would be, as far as where I'm sitting at, I think the alternates would be a good thing.
Okay. Meetings, this is language about, generally you would have, you have provisions for a chairperson or something like that, this just sets that out. Each review board shall appoint a person as secretary. You've got different language on that in your existing ordinance, sometimes it's staff, sometimes it's unclear. So this is just saying that you would have somebody designated to serve as the secretary, whether or not it's staff or an appointed member, kind of depends on the timing. And then just the boards can set whatever their regular meeting dates are for the next year. Quorums and decisions, this gets to it takes 3 to make a decision, 3 members, either the regular or alternates that are creating that quorum of the day. If you have like if you're accepting bylaws and stuff, we're not holding that level. You can just whatever the majority is, a simple majority. And then, again, this should be common knowledge, but we put in there that you shouldn't be making a decision or reviewing stuff if you have a conflict of interest. Now, that can get a little gray area, and that's where some good training comes into play. But we're trying to, basically, if you've got a direct financial or inherent interest in some kind of issue, you really should not be part of this. So then we talk about the individual review board. So the organization enrolls at the planning commission. The organization, you have already, it's set out in the ORC, we just cross-reference that again. The roles are really related to approval of the master plan as it comes through. They usually have, that's just a standard practice that's in the ORC. Making recommendations to council related to amendments of the text and code. We'll come back and talk about the PUDs and whether there's a need for revision to that. They're going to be reviewing and acting on the preliminary subdivision plats and final subdivision plats as we currently discussed. Subdivision modifications, which I'll explain a little bit, when we get into that process, that is a modification of the actual technical design standards, not just a variance across the board. So if city engineer, the engineering construction standards say you're gonna have a certain level of pipe, and they have an argument why they shouldn't, they want a variance, they can get that through the planning commission, through the process we establish, which does, again, just like a variance requires hearing. Hear, review, and make decisions on alternative equivalency review. That's a new procedure we have in here that we talked about in the code audit. So that's what we term the positive variance, where somebody has an idea that could better meet a certain intent. We see this in like landscaping and screening. If they've got a better approach, what this would require is that they have to go to the planning commission through a public hearing with notice to adjacent owners that they can come and show that they meet or exceed the intended standard, and it's a case-by-case review. Do we see these, being used rampantly? No, but it does set out that process, and the planning commission is a good board for that. And then other, things that the city council or the ORC may designate. Nothing exciting. The roles of the BZA, again, this hasn't changed as drafted. One of the discussions, I'm not sure, well, I guess I may have put this somewhere lower down, and maybe I should have brought it up here. So, your Board of Zoning Appeals currently does a lot of review. They review variances, they review the conditional uses, they're looking at nonconformities, they're looking at all, and appeals, obviously, and stuff like that. One of the questions we didn't get into in the code audit, and it really just is going through this, is that working? Appeals, absolutely. Board of Zoning Appeals, variances, absolutely. The one that is quirky, and again, this is a situation where some communities do one thing and some others do not, is I'm seeing more cities, townships can't do this, more cities move conditional uses into the planning commission's realm. The reason being is there's a little bit of a site plan element to that. You're looking at things on more of a case-by-case basis. You're looking at adjacent land and land uses and activities as part of the kind of judgment call on that. Is it wrong to have it in the BZA? Absolutely not. There are a lot of communities that have the BZA review it. It's just been an interesting discussion I've seen happening among communities nowadays. You may say it's working well. I kept it as you currently do it now, but I did want to raise that as a point of kind of discussion amongst the community.
Do I have to speak about that now? Because if I had, because I gotta oversee the Board of Zoning Appeals and one planning commission, just me, I'll say it loud, public meeting, I trust the planning commission to make the decision a lot more than that BZA as far as on something on conditional use. That's my 2 cents. I've sit on both boards, but, you know what I mean? Just with the expertise we have in the planning commission, I believe we have a great mix of engineers, contractors, economic development folks, business owners, and then on the other end, we don't have that. We have one engineer and then others are sprinkled around. That's just my opinion.
The other problem, and I've seen this happen in other towns, where you start establishing non-conforming uses, it more often happens in variances, where at some point, the municipality has got itself boxed in that it has to grant conditional use permits or variances, because you've changed the neighborhood with previous variances or conditional uses. And usually, one of the requirements for variances, that the area has changed. So what you've done is you set in motion, eventually changing the whole district, or a good part of the district.
So with that discussion, let me point out what is what is supposed to be the differences between a variance and a conditional use. So variance is where the applicant is asking for you to reduce a standard. So they don't want to meet a setback. So it's 10-foot setback, but they want to be 8-foot setback. They want a taller building, they want a bigger sign, anything like that, where they're trying to, for just the reasons, that they're just asking for that. The standards for variance that's been established long in case law is not that something has changed. That's a major difference. It is that there's a practical difficulty or a necessary hardship. Practical difficulty, quite often, a good example I send is you've got a really odd lot configuration, like triangular lot, that's not like your more traditional interior square lots, and somebody's gonna nip into, put a square building on a triangular lot, you might nip into a little bit of a rear setback because of the weird lot config. That's a practical difficulty. So that's what the BZA should be looking at in variances, and we have expanded, or I've expanded on the criteria to try to explain it as best as I understand from the current case law. So a variance, if the BZA is consistently giving approvals on a variance, let's say they're constantly giving approvals for a 2-foot setback or a 2-foot extension in the setback, you might want to rethink whether or not you shouldn't just say you can be that as a standard. So where you're having a lot of approvals, you have to have the question of, do we have the wrong rule? A conditional use, on the other hand, is established in, and you have this provision in, I think, the industrial district, I'm correct, only. We're talking about expanding its use. A conditional use is more about, there are certain uses that might be appropriate in a particular zoning district with some additional review. So, common ones I see are bed and breakfast in a residential district, because it's a commercial operation. So we wanna take a little bit more careful look at how you're gonna run that business and how it's gonna be separated from the other homes. You will see certain types of commercial uses in your office or retail districts that might be pretty intense for, especially like your office district, that might be a little intense, but depending on the situation might be appropriate, depending on a lot of things like the intensity of the use, the amount of parking you would have to put in, all those type of things. So conditional use does not necessarily reflect whether things have changed, but it's also not a practical difficulty. It is truly a case-by-case type of thing. You will see later on when we talk about the conditional use review criteria, I have a much more expanded set of discretionary review criteria that would apply across the board for all conditional uses. And there may be additional ones that would be assigned to each conditional use. So the bed and breakfast example, you might have the standards that say, okay, as part of that conditional use, they can't have any more than 5 rooms. They can't serve meals outside of to guests or, beyond the guests. You can have additional criteria they would have to meet. So that's a little bit, that's why I've seen the split more, like you said, the planning commission tends to get a little bit more into site plan, discretionary kind of reviews like that. But that's not to say, again, that BZAs are necessarily a bad board to have it. As I mentioned, townships are different. The state says that Township Board of Zoning Appeal will review all conditional uses, period. And that may be where all this is stemmed from. I have just found with cities, I am finding more cities shifting to the planning commission reviewing them. And it's not, other than making sure the planning commission understands that, it's not like a huge shift to say that's their role, but I did want to raise that.
I like the idea of the planning commission handling those conditional uses.
How does planning commission, how do our planning
But
commission
I think
members?
what do planning commission members
I
do
think it
about
fits
that?
better with them too.
I'm just one voice here.
He has to get a raise. We'll double it. Now you got 2
Yeah, we'll
zeros.
we'll double your salary.
0.00, Mr. Lebowski.
I don't have a problem.
Yeah, I'd have no problem.
No.
I had a,
Yes.
I like what you said about conditional use with more review, to see how, what I understood you to say, can it fit there with more rules? So it's just not like a 20-minute meeting, we can give a conditional use, it has to be reviewed. And
Right.
some things need different rules.
So that's the one thing, and you do have some review criteria for each of your procedures. I have expanded on that. So the variance stuff, that is very much embedded in like case law, so it literally is just the dumping factors, there you go. Conditional uses, there are some that are set in case law that I've seen, but there's a lot more that gets, if you had a chance to look at that, I was starting to scroll down to it, it gets into a little bit, they're discretionary, that's why you have a board review it. You can see here, I've got 14 criteria, so that's where it's looking at things like the proposed use will not involve uses, activities, processes, et cetera, that will be detrimental to other, adjacent property owners and the like. It's looking at the character of the neighborhood it's fitting into, that type of thing.
And I think the planning commission has a better read on something like that than Board of Zoning Appeals.
Well, I agree 1,000,000%. I do. And I think, I don't know that it means anything more, but I think on that planning commission, you gotta remember, you have a vote in that,
Yeah.
you know what I'm saying? And I would have a vote in it versus,
Right,
you know,
Board of Zoning Appeals,
yeah.
right?
And I think they look at, they'd be looking at a higher elevation view of it versus
Yeah.
just one
And,
singular
and,
thing.
one thing that we haven't done that, and we can look around town and see the effect, we haven't put the brakes on some of these conditional uses to say, wait a minute, let's look at this. Let's take some time and look at this instead of, Board of Zoning Appeals deciding in a half hour. Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, I will, like I said, this is where it's beneficial to have these discussions. I revise and put that out there. And then I have an explanation that, hey, this is another thing that's changed. But certainly, this is one where we can move forward with this, and if later on, we rethink it, and you're like, that's not gonna work, we can always go back,
Oh, yeah.
so. Okay, well then, other than that, the BZA is, I would argue, the best one for the variances and for the appeals. They are going through essentially a quasi judicial, they're the judge in that case. And then I've added some standard language I usually incorporate with BZAs about how they have the power of subpoena and those type of things to compel people to testify. And then we get in the design review board. So again, this is drawn from your chapter 1333. And there's a couple of questions. I didn't change the makeup of it. The makeup of it is reflective of what I see commonly. Though there's, ultimately, I don't think we have to answer this now, but ultimately I will want to better define downtown where they have that role. Does it coincide with the zoning district, or is there a broader need for a larger overlay district or that type of thing? But it is something that I was like, how do you define downtown where they have to do this? But I did have a bigger, again, this is one that I didn't even think to have really when we were talking about this in the code audit, but I thought we'd think long-term. And so my question is, the way you've written your design review board is quite similar to typically what we see with the Historic Preservation Commission. So I would imagine that may have been where the language came from about having an architect or design specialist. But long-term, one of my questions is do you think at some point in the next 5 to 10 years, the city may want to embark on that next step of local historic district designation or local historic site designation, where you would have a historic preservation commission where we could use the design review board to serve as that. In which case, do we want to reflect that in this draft, noting that there are no current districts or your current designated landmarks, but at least set you up that with the one, I'd have to add a process of how you would designate it. And the typical designation for local historic district and landmarks is in this case, the design review board does their study and says, yes, we think this meets it for certain reasons. They make a recommendation to planning commission makes a recommendation to council makes the decision. And then in that case, usually what happens is there's a certificate of appropriateness review in those districts, and you have a set of guidelines or standards that might apply. Many communities just use the federal Secretary of Interior's guidelines, which aren't strong, like there's not a lot of huge teeth in them, but it, does, so they're not saying, oh, you can't have vinyl or you can't do this, but it's a good starting point from the standpoint of review. So again, you don't have that now, but in incorporating this, it brought the question of, is there potential for that?
have we gotten to the issue of our ordinances, the way it's written, is totally voluntary. It can be ignored by anybody who wants to build anything. And that's been a problem. It was written in some time ago. So that,
We'll have there's another chapter that will be in here on enforcement procedures. But the way this is being written is to be much stronger on you have to do X, Y, and Z. Now, with historic review and even with the design review, certificate of appropriateness and stuff like that, there is guidelines, in which case, you can set out how, you set out the difference between a standard, which is you are going to meet this, and guidelines, and how you write those guidelines is important in giving the teeth to say something. With historic districts, I usually also lay out, and certificates of appropriateness in historic districts, I usually lay out an extra level of determination, which is you look at whatever they're asking you to do and determine if that has any significance to the historic district. And if it doesn't, you have a lot more leniency versus if it's, for example, if it's the accessory building out back that nobody sees and they want to demolish it, have at it. If they want to tear off a brick facade and put up some plastic whatever, you would have the teeth to be like, no, that's just not going to happen here. So there's different ways to write, I think, what you're getting at, and we've
talked about that
Yeah.
repeatedly, so.
Yeah. But right now, while it is written, the design review board and the guidelines is written, it's like, let's say it's a hint of historic preservation. It's not officially. And again, I'm not suggesting that you officially go through the process of designating anything right now, but if you think in the next 5 or 10 years, you might want to establish downtown, or you've got lovely residential neighborhoods that have a very historic characteristics that you might say, we'd like to designate that neighborhood, just in order to protect certain things, and for each district you can set guidelines. I'm not saying you do that as part of this process, but we can at least give you the language to do it.
Wendy, is that an overlay type of situation, or what are you?
Typically it is.
Okay.
So typically with historic districts, it would be an overlay district, so you
Right.
know.
Okay.
And even if, I think that's where I'm getting with the question, even then with downtown, is even if we say, no, we're not worried about historic preservation, we might want to establish a downtown overlay district, unless it absolutely, the boundaries coincide with the central business district.
Mhm.
In which case, we just say, this rule applies to the central business district.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, and then with landmarks, usually it's not an overlay district, it's just embedded in the code that says this address, this site, this historic site has been designated and is subject to these rules.
Okay.
Well, I would say, yeah, within the next 5 to 10 years, there's gonna be a need for it.
Have any of the,
Yeah, we sure have enough. Well,
Yeah,
right here.
well,
There-
I mean, we're the county seat.
Right.
You've got a historic building in the county courthouse, for starters, so.
yeah, right now, if they wanna tear that courthouse down, there's nothing, there's just,
That's right. And there's have been buildings built downtown, in the same period, that, yeah, we'd like to preserve them if at all possible. And encourage their preservation.
So what I'll do is
And that goes for the neighborhoods you talked about too.
So-
East Time.
So when I make these revisions, I do make them in red lines, so you will see what I previously wrote versus what I'd added. The way I would probably do this for you, since you don't have the designation now, is still keep the design review board as the name, but set it up as a language that in the future they could be basically used as the role of a historic preservation commission, and then set out that as one of their authorities. And again, part one procedure I will add to here is, what is the procedure to establish a local historic district, or designate a lot or structure as a historic site, and what that means. So, 5 years from now, and this is something where a neighborhood could come together and say, you know what, we didn't like that new house that went in, we feel like we would like to be locally, designated, because that gives you the authority to set up what the guidelines are. They don't have to be overly, specific, or I shouldn't say specific, they don't have to be overly burdensome. They could just say, you know what, listen, we need the houses to all be brick, or we need them to, maybe you take it to architecture, character, or that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different things you can work within that, but we need to set up the process to do it. I will ask, with the downtown, are you just applying this rules to the central business district, or is there a?
Well, if you look in the in chapter 1333, it
Yeah.
designates an area that is inside of the central business district.
So we probably need to have a design overlay district of some sort?
Right.
Okay. Easy enough. Okay. The makeup of the design review board hasn't changed, and like I said, this is probably looking through that makeup is why I was like, man, this is like a lot of people's historic review boards, so why not be that? And then, and actually, the only probably change I might make to that is one owner of a property in the downtown New Philadelphia, or it could be one person who is at least one person who would be either part of that overlay district or historic overlay district, so we'll give you a little bit of flexibility in that. The code administrator, we talked a little bit about this. This is the new terminology for whichever person you're gonna kind of, again, it could be you and then you designate it down to anybody else. The one thing I note is depending on how we, what kind of authority we put in the city engineers authority, something we might add that, depending on if they have an actual formal decision-making role in here. Sometimes I have communities that do want to set aside certain roles for the service director versus the code administrator. That we can all tweak this, but for ease of this is the approach we did. And this does draw on some of your existing language of the role of your administrator. And then that's where appeals comes in. The decisions, the administrative decisions of the administrator on permits, that the like would go through the appeals board. The one thing is if they're appealing a building permit application, it goes through that review. All right, any questions on that? See, we're doing good.
Yeah, we are.
All right, now we get into these actual lovely review procedures. So I focused on, this is where I focused on what you have now and what you needed, and the ones, the couple that we recommended in the code audit. So we have a purpose statement. Summary of the review procedures. I have found this helpful. This is one of those things you don't need. It just lets people know what section they need to look to and who's involved in that decision-making process. I make it very clear up front that, this is just for a guide and that the actual procedure itself, the language of the procedure applies. But here we make the distinction between whether it's a public hearing, whether it's a public meeting and a decision is made, not everything has to happen at hearings, or whether it's an adjudication hearing, which is your variances and your appeals. And there's a different kind of authority to that. Common review requirements, I talked a little bit about this in the code audit. This is where I have consolidated all things that apply to all procedures, so you don't have to copy and paste everything and have different rules that apply to different procedures. Authority to file, so obviously with, it's the applicant could be the owner or representative and stuff like that, except for amendments, in which case council or planning commission can initiate amendments to the text or the map without even without the homeowner or the property owner being on board. That's very rare. Usually there's a discussion, but that is the authority that planning commission council has. The application submission schedule, so what date does everything have to be in if you want to be on the planning commission or BZA agenda or council's agenda is something that the code administrator will set based on regular meetings. So if the regular meetings is second Tuesday every month, when do you want information to be submitted in order to put that on the agenda? Application content, again, we took out, you didn't have a lot of this in here, so I didn't have to pull a lot out, but what is actually submitted per application is the checklist that would be attached to the application. and that becomes by reference a requirement. I've added this complete application determination, which allows the code administrator to say, you actually submitted everything that planning commission needs to review this adequately. I don't know if you have any problems with this, but especially the more you let planning commission review, in particular like conditional use type of stuff. If they're required to have a landscaping plan to show screening, and they're required to have a parking plan, and they're like, oh, I'll get it to you, this would say, no. Planning commission gets us a week out, we need this week out, and if you don't get it to us in time, you don't get to be on the agenda. There's only a couple days to make that determination. For the most part, that's pretty easy. It does allow some flexibility, so if there is a requirement for something that doesn't come into play on a certain application, there is some leeway for the code administrator to say, that's okay, that one you don't need to have. What it prevents, and I've been on your side, I've been a zoning commissioner, it prevents what we call designing at the podium, which is them trying to dazzle you at the podium without giving the public or the planning commission or the BZA any advance notice of what they're proposing. If this isn't a problem now, that's good, probably will be a problem. If you have a problem with that now, this will take a little getting used to, but then it's the benefit of everybody. Simultaneous processing of applications. This is especially useful if, like, the BZA was hearing everything, they could technically hear a conditional use and a variance at the same time. But if two things have to be reviewed, code administrator can decide if it goes one after the other or who sees it first. Easy enough. Pre-application conferences or meetings. This allows, there are certain situations where we say they're allowed to go meet with planning commission or the code administrator in advance of an application to have a discussion on what do you think about this? How does this work? Get answers to questions. This lays out that you can do that. They can meet with the design review board on the COA, Certificate of Appropriateness. The important part of this is whatever happens during those discussions is not binding. So you're not making recommendations, you're not making whatever discussions happen, that nothing is required to commit to that. Fees. This establishes that the fee schedule is set outside of this ordinance, so you don't have to constantly change it through an amendment. And then that it's due at the application time, and what happens, how do people get refunds? They traditionally don't unless they overpaid or they pull it within a certain amount of time. General provisions for attendance and decisions. So this basically sets out that when there's a requirement for attendance at a meeting, a hearing, they can attend that in person, or they could send a representative in their place. It also allows the code administrator to accept written comments in advance of the meeting or the hearing. When things are required in writing, that could also include email nowadays. And also, I added this number 3 in here, that if virtual meeting, the discussions are authorized, they can attend virtually as much as in person. That's obviously a new change we've seen since COVID. Universally, all board meetings are public meetings, but not all public meetings are public hearings. So there's different notification for public meetings versus hearings. So public meetings, you have to meet the standard Sunshine Law public meeting notice. So we just referenced that. Public notification for hearings, so this is where you're requiring special notice for conditional uses, variances, appeals, zoning amendments, and the like. This sets out what the required content is, and this also sets out this table what the notice requirements is. Were published versus written, like mailed notice. So I wanted to talk about this generally because you're a little bit all over the board from what I can read. So sometimes there's a need to make things all equal across the board. Sometimes you might want to tweak it. So with code text amendments, like what we're doing here, there's no written notice required, but there is going to be published notice. Zoning map amendments, again, published notice. Here's where I'm a little different, and this is where I brought up that there might need to be a zoning change before we do this. Right now, notice is written in accordance with the minimum of state law. Except that you only have to do adjacency. So I kept the 200-foot notice that you currently kind of discuss in a couple of places. The one thing that could be an issue, we are planning to make suggested zoning district changes. Right now, the way your language is written is that would require written notice to every single person where there's going to be a zoning map district. The state has an exemption that says if there's more than 10 properties being rezoned, you don't have to do that written notice. Because you don't have that provision in your current code, you're gonna be noticing everybody unless you make that tweak now,
Yeah.
before we get down to this later on. So I'm just highlighting that now. I have added that language in here now so that down the line, if you were gonna do another massive remap, you would still have to do published notice, but you might not have to do individual written notice.
Taking notes, Marvin?
I am, I was writing, I was looking up about the public notice.
Yeah,
I was, Ohio Public Meeting Notice Requirements.
yeah.
Does publication consist of, do you actually have to publish it, or is publishing today now on the internet?
So, and I haven't looked at the most recent requirements, but,
That's what I was pulling
yeah,
up.
I know.
Here,
So
look at
again,
that.
public, not public hearing, public meetings,
Uh-huh.
it depends. I believe, and don't hold me, I can look at this later, but I believe with things like regularly meetings, they can just establish, like, publish that at the end of the year saying, for 2024, they will be meeting the first Tuesday of every month, and that's all you need.
Okay.
For special meetings, there's, I think, provisions where you don't even have to do published notice. You can, as best as you can, put the notice outside City Hall. If you've got Facebook, put it out there where it's gonna be, no major actions can take place in that. And then I think there are other situations where it could be, I don't know outside of that, I mean, other than setting special meetings or regular meetings.
I didn't know if they were getting away from requiring the publish in the newspaper for certain things.
So I've heard rumor, but I have not been able to find that.
Okay.
For hearings, because I've actually worked with a couple communities now where it's like a weekly newspaper,
Right.
and they're like, what are we supposed to do? And so I've heard that there is an exception where you can post it in 5 prominent areas of the city, so City Hall, post office, library, whatever it is. I have yet to find that, but there's like a huge packet on public notification, because there's so many different public boards in Ohio.
Right. That's what I was-
So I need to look at what the most recent change is, but my understanding is it generally hasn't changed that published means in the paper. Now, again,
That's what I thought you were gonna tell me.
no, I wish, there is an exception, I think, like I said, for special meetings, you have
Okay.
24 hours notice where you don't have to put it in the paper. And so what I see is communities put like a notice on City Hall and then they put it on Facebook or, that kind of thing.
For the city's website.
Yeah. But most communities are acting at regular meetings, and so I do believe you can just notice that once for all the year, and you're done.
Okay.
That may also be why sometimes planning commissions and BZAs don't change as they go. They're just like, we're always gonna meet forever on the second Tuesday of the month or whatever. But I can look that up and see what changes, because, with COVID, there was, I think, certain executive orders that allowed for changes, and then I think those got pulled back, but it's unclear.
Okay.
So you're recommending that we amend our existing ordinance that says anyone within 200 feet has to receive notice?
So,
Yeah.
you have it now that written notice goes to everybody within 200 feet. You have that for planning commission and city council's hearing. Now, some communities let's just start with zoning amendments, zoning map amendments. It's not unusual for zoning map amendments of like a single property or something like that you want notice to go beyond the property owner. The minimum is it has to go to adjacent, but I would tell you that the vast majority of communities I work with notice at least 100 to 200 feet around. So that's gonna capture a couple of tiers of properties there. I am not, so I think that's reasonable. The one part I'm saying is I think once you get over the 10 properties, there starts to be an issue in cost, whether it's a whole bunch of people coming together to do it or the city. I mean, if we're talking about adding a couple of new districts, there's gonna be thousands of people we might have to notice. So my suggestion is you might wanna consider adjusting your notification for zoning map amendments soon. Otherwise, we're gonna be notifying everybody when we do this.
Right.
Otherwise, we've gotta take that into account when we look at the zoning district. I'm not trying to be non-transparent, I'm not trying to hide stuff. But there is a extreme cost now with, like the public, or the written notice. Well, certainly the process we have to make these amendments is meant to have a lot of public notice. We're gonna have a public meetings before we do this. So we're certainly gonna try to get the word out. But that one exemption is something you don't have now. So, then with conditional use, alternative equivalency review appeals, and where you have public hearings with potentially the planning commission and the BZA, things got a little quirky in how I was reading it in different sections. I generally read that there's the 200-foot notice. The one exception seemed to be in appeals, where it said that the notice only had to go to the property owner, and it was like, usually you're gonna notice at least the adjacent. So I made it all equal, but I wanted to, I guess, generally open up the question about notice and see if this makes more sense to make things equal across the board, or what.
Question.
Yeah.
We're presently mired in a conditional use circumstance.
Okay.
The 200 feet notice may or may not have been followed. But the notice to, and then the ability for someone to come in and be heard beyond that 200 feet.
So,
We're presently experiencing maybe a half mile away.
so there's a whole bunch of issues in the question. It's a good question, don't get me wrong. So off the top of my head, would have to go back and look at what your notice requirements for everything outside of zoning amendments is a mixed match. So I can't even remember if the conditional uses require the 200 feet. This is just saying, moving forward, we're saying it would be 200 feet. When it comes to, pardon, this may be where you can jump in too, but when it comes to other people coming in and talking, most communities are not saying, no, you can't, like, let's say they're 300 feet away or half a mile or whatever. When I do training for boards, I say, listen, they tell you where they live, hopefully. They say, my name is so-and-so and I live here. The one caveat to that, my understanding is, like with appeals, I believe, there's certain case law, and I'm not an attorney, where there's parties of interest. So if somebody came from across town to counter an appeals action, you could say, thanks, but that has no relevance here. But with conditional uses and stuff, most boards allow for input from a broader mix. But as far as how of how the notice gets out, it's specifically just targeting, it's essentially making sure that adjacent residents know, but not necessarily excluding the rest, if that makes sense.
Okay, and what about those circumstances where those that desire to be heard or have already been heard are actually outside of the city limits?
So typically what I have done is I will allow them the same courtesy of comment, but you are not beholden to account for that. Now, could they have a great idea? Yeah. But you also are not necessarily, you don't have to say, well, we heard 50 people speak, and 49 of those people opposed it, but of those 49, 30 of them were not, from the city. You can take that into account as part of your discussions.
So your recommendation is there on the side of caution and allow more public input? Because the issue that he's talking about, there
Yeah.
might be 60 or 70 people here, they're all gonna, 30 of them are gonna say the same thing, and these 30 are gonna say the same thing.
So, this is where I see bylaws come into play more. And so I've seen planning commission and board of zoning appeals set up bylaws that say, at the beginning of a public hearing, here are the rules of our public hearings. If you want to say something that has already been said, you are welcome to get up and say, I concur with so-and-so, but don't just reiterate it and like spend 20 minutes reiterating. We want you to just say, I concur, and that's all. So I do have communities that set up bylaws on procedures and stuff like that. I think the challenge is, and what I'm saying is, I think you can allow them to speak, but I'm saying I think the board members can judge whether or not their comments are relevant because of their location. I think it would be more challenging to be like, oh, you're in the city, but you're 500 feet away, you have no say. I think that would be more detrimental to the city than anything.
Well, how about just giving notice to those people? Just notice of the hearing,
Well, there's gonna be notice
for
of,
people who are not inside the corporation.
well, the notice is going to be, there's always gonna be notice of public meetings, like I said. So, if somebody from outside of the city, they're obviously finding out about this or not. But the city, what's the right amount of notice?
Well, when you go back and talk about the 200 feet.
Yeah.
Well, 200 feet may be outside the city limits.
Yeah.
What kind of notice are you giving them? Is it
Do we
direct
still have
notice?
to give them notice since
That's a
they're
good
out of the
question.
city?
I'm not sure what I don't,
That's a really good question.
yeah, I'm gonna put a note on that. Most communities that I know do it regardless of municipal boundaries. But I'm not sure if you're absolutely mandated to that. That's a good question. I'll have to look into
They're
that.
obviously considering something that's gonna affect them, regardless of whether it's inside inside the city or not.
Right. I was like, Larry, why are you commenting on code? But that's because it's your word, it's okay. I just realized that. I'm gonna be like, I didn't make that comment. Like I said, I think most communities just do it, and it's, because the requirement, as we set up and like how you identify, it's just you look at the county auditor, it's not necessarily by the municipal boundary and stuff like that. And so most communities do it that way, it's 200 feet regardless of whether it's in the city or not. I think your question was more of, if they're coming in and commenting from across the city with no relative interest in the area or the lot of itself, I think that's where, anybody can get up and speak. I think you as board members have to judge what information is gonna be used in the debates and the discussions. I do a lot of planning commission, board of zoning training, and I've sat on the zoning commission myself. And one of the things I always say is just because somebody says something to you doesn't mean you have to take it as steadfast fact. They could, if they've got documentation and proof, that's one thing or not, but, you've probably all been in the public hearings where somebody's like, oh, the traffic, you should see the traffic in it. It's like, tell me what kind of traffic. The story I always tell is when I was on a zoning commission, I had a member of the public during the coming hearing say, you should see the amount of traffic that goes along Stumpy Lane, it's like an interstate. And I literally had to be like, I live on Stumpy Lane, I know it's a fabulous street though then. I live on Stumpy Lane, it's a county road. If I see 3 cars go by in a day, I'd be shocked, And so, you as board members have some ability to, take account for what is being presented to you, but I'm not sure where you can prevent somebody from speaking. So you're just gonna have to gauge, what they're trying to represent. But I also think having better rules for public hearings can help reduce time.
I like the rules, I like to have it spelled out
Yeah.
and procedurally and exactly what you can and can't do. That's why I was looking at your what you had listed for procedures.
So I have the basic procedures, but I also say that each board can adopt their own bylaws, and those
I see what
bylaws are
you're
where we
saying.
typically see the individual rules for how public hearings run.
Okay.
Because there are communities, and I can, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, it depends on how it goes. There are communities that say you get 5 minutes, you get 3 minutes, whatever it is. There's arguments that that's not necessarily fair, because you usually give the applicant all the time they want. For the most, but, you know, some communities, their bylaws say if there's an extensive crowd, we have the ability to limit time for speaking. But a lot of them do say, listen, if you, please, for the sake of all of our sanity, if you are going to reiterate what somebody else says, just tell us you concur, tell us where you live, and then we'll move on. Like, that's good.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to send you some examples of bylaws I've seen and across the board. The other way bylaws are used also is to spell a better definition of conflict of interest. So some bylaws will say, you know, here is how you recuse yourself and when we expect you to recuse yourself. You know, financial interest is one thing, but, you know, I've literally sat and heard a planning commissioner say, well, I disagree with what the BZA said, and I think we should turn the site plan down because I'm the neighbor. And I went, okay. So, yeah, I can send you some bylaws, but that's one way of keeping those hearings under control. And you'll see copies of the bylaws and procedures set out for people. So you sign in and you get a copy of the procedure. It also prevents people from trying to question the applicant when that should be the role of the board, and that type of thing. Let's see. Thanks.
See ya. Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
So beyond that, I mean, does it make sense to make 200 the consistent notice for a written notice?
Yeah.
Again, these are just the public hearings, so these aren't regular meetings. This is where there's some kind of discretionary review, zoning changes, and that type of thing. Okay. Published notice, after I do a little bit more digging, is where we stand right now, because I think things have changed since COVID. I'm not sure that how they've continued to authorize, whether or not there's been changes in even authorization for virtual meetings and such. The rest of this, there is provision that said the city can also provide any additional notice they want. I mean, I know you're active on Facebook, you know. This is the minimum you have to do. There's nothing to say you can't put more notice out there. Conduct of public hearing, again, this might be something that, you know, could be incorporated bylaws, but this is, again, some general stuff. So this is saying each person who appears at a public hearing, you know, they have to identify themselves, or whether or not they're there on behalf of somebody else. Continuance of a public hearing or deferral of an application. So an applicant could ask to be deferred or have something, you know, pushed off for another thing. If they ask the code administrator to do this prior to publication of notice, then the code administrator could say, yeah, that's fine, we'll put it off till the next month, because you haven't paid to put the notice out. If they request it after publication, then it's gonna be on the review board to decide whether or not they're gonna table it, because people are probably gonna come, because they got notice, they're gonna wanna know when officially it's being tabled to, or what's happening to it. And then obviously the review board can, at their own discretion, can motion to continue a public hearing, whether it's open or not. There is a again, going back to the rules and procedural stuff of public hearings, there is an opening of the public hearing and a closing. You know, you can open a public hearing, and if it's really long, I've sat in public hearings till 2 in the morning. I don't advise that. You can, after so many hours, say, we are going to continue this. The public hearing is still open, and you just continue it to the later time. Because you'll see a lot of times we have a decision-making deadline that is after the close of the hearing. So after everybody's had a say, that's when you close the hearing and have your discussions. Withdrawal, anybody can request to have it withdrawn. They're gonna submit in writing to the code administrator. After the request for withdrawal has been received, the code administrator will then withdraw the application from the agenda, and no additional action is needed. I will say though, as we note in the fees, they don't get the feedback, just because they say, you know what, we changed our mind, we're not gonna do it. Yep, thanks, we have used your fee already. The rest of this is pretty basic. Examination, obviously, there's records that'll be at city offices. The effect of the approval, so obviously whatever approval is granted, that's what the permit should be issued under. And they don't get to proceed unless they get all the necessary approvals. So if they need a variance and a conditional use, they gotta get all of that before they get their zoning compliance review. Modification or amendments, that's gonna go through the same process unless it is extremely minor technical issue. Reapplication after denial of an application. You have a little bit of this language in your zoning amendment process. It basically says you don't get to resubmit for another year. I've expanded that. So because, one, this would apply to any application, not just zoning amendments. And so what this basically lays out is what happens if you get denied. So obviously, there's appeals. Every procedure is gonna have an appeals process. So you can, that's option one. Option two is if you didn't listen to the board the first time, and maybe the board said, oh, you should make these changes, and you said, no, I don't wanna do it, and they say, well, okay, you're denied, you could come back and decide to finally make those changes and try to reappeal, or try to reapply. You can wait 24, I say 2 years, I give them 2 years. If they're just gonna come back with the same old thing, they should wait 2 years. The other option is if somebody new comes in, let's say they sell the property or whatever, that somebody else could come in with an entirely new design premise, design application, then that, you know, they can still reapply for conditional use or something like that. So we're just spelling out what their options are.
In your experience, have you had people come in requesting a conditional use that don't actually own the land, that are considering buying it and they want it changed ahead of time? Is that
So,
normal?
I've seen that with zoning amendments too.
Okay.
And so typically what happens, I think I have that question later on, is whether or not you would want, for any zone change or any application, that I think the owner should be a signatory.
Right, I
Right.
agree with that.
However, it is very common to see that the person who is requesting it is not the owner. And that's because somewhere there's a contingency on that sale of the land that they get a zoning amendment, but that is not beholden to you to make the change. You are looking at this from the interest of the city and the interest of this code.
Okay.
Whether or not that sale's gonna happen because of your decision, that's not your issue.
Understood.
Yeah, no, but usually, applications require, the signatory of the owner that they're okay with it.
How do you define owner? You got somebody with a long-term 90-year lease.
It's the
that
lease,
owner?
it's not the lease, I mean, the lease holder can be the applicant, but you would typically on the application have the actual property owner, per the county auditor, be a signatory on that, because everything ends up in their lap if something goes awry. So, at least, because I don't think, I'm a property owner that gets leased out, not for 5 years. I would be extremely ticked off to find out my leaseholder applied for something that I didn't know about. So traditionally, you would have whoever at least one of the owners of record put their signature on an application that at least acknowledges that they're okay with moving forward with this application. But the applicant itself could be that leaseholder, could be somebody who is, it's who is authorized, and could be anybody. I have attorneys come in all the time, I see attorneys apply, and they're the applicant, they're there on behalf of some mysterious potential developer.
Yeah.
It happens. Obviously, subsequent development, obviously, if you get an approved conditional use and there's criteria, or approved variance with criteria, you're gonna have to meet those criteria. And then the records, you know, obviously you have to maintain all permanent records, related to state law. So we have about 30 more minutes before we're gonna try to wrap this up. I think we can get through a couple of these procedures. Code and text amendments, this is procedure you have now. I supplemented this with information, but it's not altogether different from what you have. One question I have is, and this goes to what we were just talking about, is who can apply for what? Zoning map amendments and zoning text amendments. This is one of the few procedures where the city has the authority to do something without the property owner being okay with it. You can rezone properties without authorization or without a signature of the property owner. Again, most communities try to get the property owners on board. One question I did have is whether or not you would want the general public to be able to make application for a text amendment. So some cities say, no, we would prefer a property owner who wants, let's say they wanna add language in here on short-term rentals. Let's say they wanna come to you on your short-term rentals. I know you're dealing with that now, but just throwing that out there. And they say, here is the language we want you to add. And they go through the process. Some communities are fine with that. Other communities would prefer that that person go to planning commission or council and essentially lobby them to initiate the text amendment. And have the city work through what that text should say, rather than it be what the resident or whoever puts it in. It goes both ways. I just didn't know if you wanna be silent on that, or if you wanna restrict who can apply for text amendments. Zoning amendments, property owners can do it, or their representative, city can do it, that kind of thing.
Changing the language, I'd rather go with option B is my opinion.
Option B being that they go to planning commission and council and ask.
Yeah, we'll get flooded as soon as that word goes out. I know our office will.
Well, technically, the way it's written now, I mean, they could. There's nothing, you don't have a prohibition on Joe Public coming in and applying to change your entire zoning code. The text of it.
I like the additional layer, but that's just my one person's opinion.
Anybody else?
I concur with Josh.
Nice.
I mean, so right now, someone could come in and to a council meeting and request this language. I mean, it still has to be reviewed and
Yeah.
everything.
Somebody else, I mean, if they really were, somebody in theory could present you with an entirely different zoning code and go through that process. Now, you might just say, yeah, we don't, you know, we're not even gonna entertain this, that might be a problematic. So that's gonna kind of force you into that review. Again, it's up to you. This is not, again, one that I'm not saying 100% go this way or not. I just have found that when it comes to the text of these codes and the text of the ordinances, that the city would like to be the one that refines the text before it goes through any process of adoption. And so they would prefer somebody who's interested in a change, whatever it may be, come to the city, come to you and say, hey, we'd like to do this, what can we do? And you might say, oh, this is great, let me talk to planning commission council. Or they might go to council and ask you to entertain that, in which case council would then initiate the text amendment and, you know, work its way through the process.
I just know the reason I went to the mayor last year is because our language is a mess the way it is. I'm hoping, to me, that just keeps the door open for it to become a mess in the future, possibly.
I don't think it happens a lot, but it's I've come into some communities where you've got, sorry to say, but there are certain residents who will just constantly apply, especially depending on what your fees are for a amendment process, will just be like, well, I'm just gonna throw this language out here and see, you know,
concur with Josh. Should be a layer where we control it.
And again, this is just a text. So zoning map amendments, if they want to come in and apply for, they can't ask to change their neighbor's property without their neighbor being on board, but, you know, they can request zoning map changes where that would still be allowed.
So if we got a residential zone where we don't allow multifamily units, we could have somebody comes in every month saying, I want this language to the council. I'm just thinking like that Rome kid who was messing with our SWIP stuff last year, who was just very persistent. We get somebody like that coming in every month. Just instead of coming in once to planning commission, have them review it and say, nah, or no, that's.
Or, I mean, this would just allow, like, if somebody would, here's what I see it usually happening, is they have an idea they would like the city to consider, and they might have model text that they might want. Typically, in the way you're kind of suggesting, what they would do is either take it to you, or take it to planning commission, or take it to council and say, we would like you to address, again, with short-term rentals as an example. That way, council can be like, oh, yeah, I think that's a good idea, but I'm not sure I buy into this text. Let us work through this, like, refinement before we start the actual adoption process. Or they might say, I like the idea of doing this, but this doesn't belong in the planning and zoning code, so it goes through a different process or a different ordinance. So it allows an extra level of consideration of where it should be and how the language should be before you start the adoption process. All right. So for a lot of these big review procedures, I have added a language about the pre-application meetings being optional. Some communities mandate pre-application conferences for, with planning commission at least, with zoning changes. I'm not so sure that's necessary. I mean, I think it's their benefit to go do it, but I don't think you need to force them to do it. So I just left it in here as an optional, as kind of a reminder that they can go to the planning commission or code administrator in advance and talk to them about what they're trying to do. Okay. So then you have the application. Obviously, most of that's spelled out in the common review requirements. If city council initiates it, they refer it to planning commission. We have, everything goes through staff. Staff can do a report, they can send it out to other agencies to take a look at. And, you know, if they want to do a staff report, they can. This is not absolutely mandating a staff report. Just to make sure I did, my comment is your current process is written in a little bit of a confusing manner, but I think I figured out what you were trying to do, which is the traditional way. So planning commission will have a public hearing, review, and make a recommendation to council. City council reviews it and they make the decision. And then city council is adopting with some modification or denying whatever recommendation comes from planning commission. E here, review criteria, this is new. Or a little bit of expansion of some language you have. This, and there are review criteria for every procedure. This gives planning commission and council something to look at when they're trying to make a decision on whether or not they should approve it or not. Look at the master plan. This is, as you were mentioning, this is where one of the things they can take a look at is what's the changing nature of the neighborhood. You know, has something economically or physically changed that this would make a better, you know, whatever is being proposed would be a better approach. I hope this never happens to you, but I have seen this come into play, not just for economic changes, but tornado goes through, and all of a sudden now you can reassess what the zoning should be. Some other kind of disaster, things happen that changes the potential use of that area. So these are things, again, this is not, you know, they don't have to check all these boxes. It's meant to, maybe I should call them review considerations. You should be considering these when you're making a decision. So that is the biggest change, is adding those review criteria. That's the procedure. That's just step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, laying it out. Any questions on that? Okay.
I like it.
Conditional uses and variances. This is currently written as one thing because the procedure is currently the same and reviewed by BZA. When I make these changes, I'll split this out and put conditional uses in the planning commission, and it'll be one procedure, very similar in nature to variances. So that will be the change, but the procedures themselves won't change, just who's responsible for them. The procedure is, again, could be the application, well, there is the application. Staff can distribute stuff to departments and agencies for comment. They can consolidate that, put it in a staff report. The BZA or the Planning Commission for Conditional Uses rewrite it will review the application and make a decision. This is where I put the question about Planning Commission being a review board. The one thing I will say here is, and this, I try to do this in all these hearings, is I did try to put some reasonable deadlines for hearing and making decisions. I did this because there's some predictability in that on both behalf of the city and the applicant, that right now you've got some language that's within a reasonable amount of time, there'll be a public hearing, and within a reasonable amount of time, there'll be a decision. That's only beneficial to the city, not necessarily the applicant, because they could go on and on and on. So what I say here is that within 45 days of the filing of an application, the applicable board would hear it, unless the applicant is okay with continuing it. Like, the applicant always can be on board with changing things, something comes up. 45 days, the reason why I use 45 days is this would generally accommodate whatever the regular meeting is, so they can hear the public meeting. So if you've got an extra long month, you can get that in there. If you have to call a special meeting, you've got some leeway. So they go through, and then they have the public hearing. Once the board closes the public hearing, so now all the public engagement is done, there's 30 days to make a decision. So usually, I'd say probably, I'm gonna guess 90% of the time, the decision's made the day that the hearing's, closed. This buys you some time if you need to have discussions as a board a little bit longer. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay.
I like that, especially because I know a lot of times, like on bigger allotments, sometimes we give them till Thursday to get something in, and, there's all of the different, storm sewer stuff we gotta really consider, and then they're coming on Tuesday, and planning commission is always just yay or nay on that day, where you should be able to say, hey, you just got us this Thursday, we'll reconvene, we need to talk about this, and,
Right.
So, and the other thing we also have is, there's an extended time frame still, even then, that would be agreed upon by the board and the applicant. Because let's say something weird comes up. Let's say stormwater, there's like some weird quirk you've gotta hammer out. In that case, you could say, listen, we need even an additional 30 days, but we're gonna try to work this out with you. It would be of the benefit of the applicant to say, oh, okay, yeah, no, I'm fine with that extended time frame, because they risk denial otherwise.
right.
So there's always the ability to extend whatever these timeframes are, as long as everybody's on board with it. If the applicant's like, no, I want a decision,
Okay.
okay, but you might not like that decision because we don't have all the information to make that decision.
Careful what you wish for.
Yeah. So we always, the intent of the way I write this is that there's predictability in timing, but there's always a little wiggle room, and it promotes working together. So the applicant should see that the benefit of, if there's a legitimate reason to continue it, they should. Otherwise, they risk denial. But the city also understands that they shouldn't be holding the applicant hostage with no good reason. So you'll see that kind of deadlines in all of these. Okay.
Do most cities, like Board of Zoning Appeals, do they make the decisions right then and there? I mean, like our two housing boards have the option to hear the applicant or the appeal, and then it's gotta be the decision given to the applicant or appellant in writing within so many days.
So we have that, you'll see that. So this says they hear it within 45 days. They open the hearing within 45 days. But then, let's say, like I said, let's say it's a really controversial thing, and let's say they need to extend that hearing to the next meeting. They just leave the hearing open and continue it. and then at the next meeting, they might close it. It's from that closing that they have 30 additional days to make a decision.
Just seems a couple of the meetings there, when you got 60 people in here all looking,
Yeah.
they're all kind of like ghost-eyed, like, oh man, I
So
gotta
that's,
decide right now.
yeah, so that's where you're gonna have to, there's a real need for an understanding of, you can open a hearing on one day and continue it, it's still open.
Okay.
So 30 days from there, you close it, you still have 30 days from that second date to make it. I have witnessed some very controversial hearings that I wasn't even a part of, I just followed along, like mining and stuff, that went for months. The hearing was literally open for months. I hope you never have to deal with that, but it happens, I get it. This accommodates that and just gives some additional time for discussion. And again, the applicant has to be a little bit reasonable, because if the board doesn't have enough information to make the decision and enough, time, they risk denial. So yeah, I think this accommodates that. I would say most most things are minor enough and they're making decisions.
Right, little variances and stuff, yeah.
I talked a little bit earlier, conditional use review criteria. This is gonna be the criteria and considerations that apply to all conditional use applications. But some conditional uses might have even more standards that we'll discuss in our next round of chapters. But this is what every conditional use is gonna go through. Same with variances. We have specific review criteria I've expanded on. The one thing I have noted is I have set out standards for area dimensional variances versus a use variance. Area dimensional variance is your most common one, They're required to have 10-foot setback, they wanna be 9 feet, okay? That's where practical difficulty, they've gotta show some kind of weird situation, by which that's when BZA can approve it. A use variance, I'll be honest, in my younger years, I would have said, there's no way that use variances should be allowed, that's a zone change, If you're not allowed to have a use in a district, you shouldn't be able to go through the BZA to allow it. But I've come to a slight adjustment in my thinking, and I've accommodated a criteria for that. And that is the scenario where there is a pre-existing building that can't be really used for whatever is a principal use in that district, but could be used for something that may fit into that situation. So, I will give you the example that changed my mind. A school, an old school is in a residential district, but they no longer want to use it as a school. So, the only way it can really be used for single-family residential, or whatever type of residential is allowed, it just doesn't, it's not, unless one person's not gonna buy a school and turn that into a huge house, usually. What this would allow is, as long as that building stands, they could come in and apply for a yoga studio or office space or some low-intensity use, that the BZA could say, okay, as long as it's that specific use and that building stands, we will authorize that. The building gets torn down or destroyed, use variance goes away. If you say, no, we want them to do a zone change, here's the problem. They come in, they ask for a zone change to commercial. They could tear that building down tomorrow and rebuild it for whatever commercial use is allowed in a commercial district. So use variance is a little bit of a protection that says, okay, I get there's a pre-existing building, and it doesn't really work for whatever the uses are allowed, but we can grant a very limited use variance.
This is the same thing as the conditional use.
Kind of, except the conditional uses in a residential usually wouldn't allow for a broad range of uses. So, I'm not sure I have one on hand, maybe I got my handy dandy, here's the zoning code I got going in for adoption. Let me bring up an example. Conditional uses are listed in the districts. Use variances tend to not be. So, this is another code I'm writing in Logan, West Virginia. They don't have zoning, by the way, right now, so this has been an entertaining. So this is their zoning table, the districts. You can see in the residential districts, the conditional uses that are allowed are specified. So you wouldn't be allowed to have any, other than in the, like possibly bed and breakfast and animal boarding, most commercial uses are not gonna be allowed at all. So a use variance would say, even a prohibited use could be considered. A conditional use is one that is specified as it's almost like that, we're not gonna allow it outright, but we're gonna specify that it could be allowed with a special review. A use variance is opening it up to what could be proposed. So a use variance is probably a little bit more limited, or, a little bit more special review.
Well, you have a variance, then if you wanna put restrictions on it, that use stops, what happens?
If the use stops, then it's like any variance. If it's like a conditional use, if it stops, you don't get to continue it. There's provisions about time limits and limitations on it, so quite often if the use variance, it's not like they can go, and it's also not like they can go do anything else except that limited use that is allowed. So that's why I'm saying is a lot of times what I'll see is they'll literally say a yoga studio is the only authorized activity, rather than, broad-based uses.
Wendy, if you got a variance request and we are 33% lot coverage, and they needed to go to 36%, it was granted for a deck.
Mhm.
And what happens then, that deck, someone else buys it, they don't like a deck, they just pour a concrete pad, which doesn't go against square footage or percent of the lot. Is that always with the lot then, that they can always do something else and have 36%, or as soon as that deck is gone is what they granted it for? You see what I'm getting at? Because we've always been kind of like, it kind of stays with it, but in a case like that, would it or not?
So it depends on how the application states and what the approval is. So if the application for the variance states, if the variance is related specifically to the deck.
Yeah, that's what I see. If it would be just that deck goes and it's gone.
Correct,
Okay,
yes.
okay.
It also,
If they just came in with a blanket and said, I need 36% lot coverage, and you grant it, then you gotta go with 36% lot
I really
coverage.
hope your BZA isn't being that broad.
Well, I hope not either, but I see what you're getting. That's the way I see it too. I just was asking,
Yeah.
okay.
Well, and again, you also, the BZA has the ability, and the planning commission will with conditional uses, they have the ability to also tack on any conditions they want as well. So, they could be very specific about it too and say, listen, no, we wanna make it absolutely clear you remove this deck, that, you lost all ability for that lot coverage, but yeah.
Okay,
And it does run with the property, not the owner.
yes,
So that approval is there, it's tied to the deck, not the person that applied.
yes.
What usually happens in that condition when they sell the house, that does not get communicated to the new owner, who automatically assumes that that's an approved,
Mhm.
tears the deck down and goes to build something the same size, thinking, now that, they should investigate that, I realize that, but I worked for an organization around a bunch of lakes, and we gave a lot of conditional uses on docks. That didn't get transmitted in the sell to the new owner, and then they find out they don't have a dock, and then we deal with it. So
Yeah.
that's the downside there.
It is, and it's a challenge to deal with that across the board, because it's one thing if it happens next year versus happens 10 years from now, right?
Exactly.
That's also why we have that language that we emphasize, the burden of proof, is the burden of proof is still on the property owner to note, that they couldn't have reasonably figured out that there was some kind of special approval. And, part of that goes to, I don't know how the city keeps their records. Some communities keep records based on the property address. So especially if you can't be like, okay, you didn't even take one chance to go, hey, what kind of records do you
Yeah.
have for my house? But, part of this too is, part of this process is trying to figure out where there's a lot of applications that make it clear that there's something that's not working. And also variances shouldn't be handed out left, right, like candy. So I would hope that especially as we move forward with these changes and really cleaning up and modernizing housing, there should be limited variance approvals out there. You know? But, you know, it's the same, even if there's not a variance approval, it's the same, you know, how many people put up accessory buildings, you know, I didn't know.
Yeah, right.
On the notices, do you also put it to the Board of Zoning Appeals? Never thought about that. The members.
No,
That's a good, you know, just seeing what we're talking about now, it's probably not a bad idea.
yeah,
To add them to it.
So,
yep.
I think this goes to, like, we've got this review committee that's doing this first round of review. I certainly think, you know, whether or not you wanna send this out to them and have them on the committee, or have them be part of the, just make sure that they're sent this after it's revised.
Right, well, yeah, and well, this is being recorded, so
Yes,
we'll send them the link to,
There you go.
to watch it.
Right.
yeah, cause now we can be like, hey, BZA, we're gonna move conditional use.
Yeah. Really, we're changing your roles.
Oh, for the better.
Just something to kind of add, something we've been kind of working on upstairs, when we're doing our permits and things
Yeah.
now. We're applying parcel numbers where we can go back and apply X and Y coordinates, to where eventually the goal is, and we're building the data to do it, to where I can map it, to where it can be put as a pin on the map, to where they can go look at it.
Technology has been
That's,
so.
we're not doing that yet,
Yeah.
but we're building the database, just like Josh is doing all this zoning stuff. That's all got a parcel number to it.
Technology has made it a lot easier for information to be tied to addresses and stuff like that, where it almost makes it impossible for people to make the argument, oh, I didn't know there was that
Well,
going on.
And we have a great connection with county, because that's where I came from. And I know the mapping system that they use over, they bought the Enterprise Esri product, so they can house other front pages,
Yeah,
and we can be a part of that, so that's kind of my longer term goal. So we can map some of that stuff, and make it a little more well-known, that you don't even need to know. Go look at your parcel and look at the dots and click on them, and what's it tell you?
Yeah.
so, back to the question of the use variance, with that provision that it's tied to, I think the language I have here is, let's see.
So then you deal with it.
There is an existing building on a lot, and such building due to its design cannot be reasonably reused for permitted use in the district. Does that sound, I mean, again, I have called out use variances as a very specific type of variance with special criteria. So this shouldn't be something that you're gonna see left, right, and the other. It's meant to be a very unique situation, and it's set to the unnecessary hardship. So there's a very high level of standard they have to meet. But again, I used to say, I didn't think use variances, you know, in my younger years, I thought I knew everything. Now I know, I'm always learning. You know, I used to think that they weren't something that should be considered, but now I see the benefit of them in certain circumstances, that where a zone change would actually be far more detrimental.
Aren't, conditional uses and variances, aren't they, or are they required in a realtor's disclosure statement?
I don't know.
Anybody know?
I don't know what,
Obviously.
I don't know what realtors are.
Need Jan here for that.
Yeah, I'll have to ask
Real
the
risk
clerk.
if they're out advising people.
I had one where they didn't disclose the violations we had on it over by the park, and they're supposed to do that. I mean, you can tell on them to the state.
You would think anything attached to the property, you know, legal documents would be, you'd have to disclose that.
But see, it's some of that kind of stuff, if you really wanted it to be known, then it should be recorded at the county recorder's office on that parcel, and
Exactly,
they'd be
that's-
able to do searches.
That's, yeah, that's what
I'm thinking of
happens.
some of
is
this, what we're talking about, some of the different variances and different things like that,
Some communities go and have required that everything be recorded. I think that can be a little bit of a challenge, but, I mean, it's, you know, especially on very specific ones that you think are gonna be long, you know, especially like a area dimensional variance where you're saying like a house can be built, you know, 8 feet from the side yard versus 10. You know, that's gonna be very permanent in nature versus some other ones that are more temporary, so.
It's easy to do that if the variance is being granted at the same time the property's being sold, because it goes right in the deed.
Yeah.
but those variances can be recorded at any time.
They can be, very often it doesn't happen.
Right,
I
right.
don't see, especially variances aren't usually are not happening at the time of a sale of a property. They're,
And I think we would just, I mean, if you wanted to do something like that, you just adjust our fee that we accommodate. They're already paying the $50 recording fee, and we take care of the recording. We go over and record it, and it's on record.
more and more though, that's where the technology, I think, is being helpful, because I mean, you're starting to see people who say, no, we've got a map document that shows where there's attached, zoning authorizations that you know, and if you buy a property, it's not like, it's very public where these approvals are, so. So it sounds like everybody's okay with keeping the experience?
Yeah.
Well, then, that moves us into the subdivisions, but we're at 3:00, so I think this is actually a very good, we'll start here next time. If you don't mind, I will touch base with you here this tomorrow maybe, and send you some dates, because if I can time it when I'm up north, I can be here in person. If not, we'll just figure out
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
yeah,
All right, but
start here.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We make good
Good stuff,
progress.
good stuff.
Pardon?